Hi, this is Jaya. In this video, we shall see the summary of Way of the Peaceful Warrior by Dan Millman. The protagonist of this story is Dan, and he is narrating the story in the first person. And here he talks about his personal growth, which actually centers on his spiritual journey. That is how his spiritual journey led to his personal growth. Now, Dan is a college student at Berkeley and is also a gymnast and is training to be a champion in that. At this time, he has some mental health crisis and is also getting a lot of nightmares. In his dream, he is able to see death, which is about to attack him. And at that time, a very old white haired man comes there and he confronts him. One day, he is not able to sleep, so he takes his car and he drives and he goes to a gas station. There he meets a mysterious man whom he calls as Socrates. That is, he keeps a nickname for him, Socrates, because he is an old man with white hair, the same man who used to come in his dreams. And Socrates also captures Dan's attention by jumping on the station's roof. And then they get into a philosophical conversation. And that time, this Socrates says that he is Dan's mentor and he will guide on a transformative journey which will lead Dan forward in his life. Now, Dan visits Socrates, and Socrates also gives him a lot of advice. And he tells him that you have to escape from the illusions of your mind, and you have to sustain your spirit, and you have to take action to experience life as a human being. And he says that I am going to be your guide into the warrior way of being. And Dan realizes his inner turmoil and decides to listen to whatever Socrates says and just practice the lessons which he is teaching him. And Socrates' practices also enables him to meditate and experience visions that gradually transform his worldview. What he's thinking about everything changes a lot after he does this meditation. And even as an athlete, he becomes successful, but somehow there is a depression in his mind. And when he asks about it to Socrates, Socrates tells him that is because of the illusions of the human mind. They are distractions from living. And Dan has a vision, and there Dan dreams of his own life's course, and he sees himself as an old man but as an unfulfilled man. And again he asks about it to Socrates, and Socrates explains that Dan must battle his mind's illusion, and that will help him to alter his future and reach the state of consciousness. At this time, Dan meets Joy, who is a Socrates student, and he falls in love with her. And Socrates prompts Dan to learn from life's experiences, and he asks him to free himself from the impulses that are actually controlling him. Now his journey advances but is fraught, and he is often struggling. And for all this, he blames Socrates because he is facing a lot of ordeals and he feels that Socrates is not guiding him properly. And at one point, Dan even considers death by suicide, but something makes him to come back to Socrates. Now Socrates helps him change his mind and take on the responsibility for his own life and says that death is not the end for everything. Slowly, Dan evolves, and Socrates advises him to accept reality and says that life will not happen like how we are planning. There will be many unplanned events in our life, and for that, we should be open. And he also suggests meditation as a tool for understanding its mind's condition. And he stresses that meditation will free him from the mind's illusion and also help him to achieve consciousness. But to meditate fully, it requires a skill to be effective. And in one of the arguments, Socrates asks Dan if he feels happy. And Socrates' teaching continued to have an impact on Dan. And though Dan resists a lot to what he is teaching, slowly he accepts the way of Socrates. And Dan visits his parents in Los Angeles. At that time, he meets an accident when he is riding his motorcycle and injures his leg severely. Now, Joy unexpectedly visits him in the hospital and encourages him to consider the experience as a mental and physical challenge. Dan slowly recovers. At that time, Socrates visits him and he understands that Dan is unwell and he asks him to go and see a doctor. And Dan discovers that he has mononucleosis. Now, Socrates visits Dan at the clinic and speeds up his healing process by performing an alternative medical practice on his leg, which helps Dan to improve faster. Now, Socrates continues his lessons by saying that Dan must change his bad habits, and he asks him to become a vegetarian, and he says that vegetarian diet will refine his functions. Now, Dan enters a period of fasting and struggles, but ultimately he manages to control his impulses, and now he gains a feeling of inner power. Later, Socrates instructs Dan to control his focus and attention with breathing exercises. A former student of Socrates named Joseph helps Dan with his breathing practice. Now, Socrates encourages Dan to fully focus on every action he is doing. At that time, Joseph dies suddenly, and this shocks Dan. But Socrates explains that death is only a transformation of the body. The person will be alive. It is only the body which goes away from here. But this viewpoint of Socrates shakes Dan, and now he resolves to live as a warrior. And Socrates pushes him hard to meditate, and he says that you have to meditate till you realize that every moment in life is special, and for this you have to give your full attention to your meditation. Now, Joy moves in and out of Dan's life. Like, she is not permanently there. Suddenly she'll disappear, again she'll come, like that. And she takes part in Dan's training, and she asks him to run in the hill along with her. And every time it will be Joy who is the first person to run ahead of Dan. Dan is not able to compete with her. And Socrates also introduces Dan to new forms of physical training, and this helps him to connect with his body. And he continues running with Joy and considers their sessions a test of the spirit. And Socrates talks to Dan about Satori, who is a Zen. And the concept of Satori refers to the state of being present in the moment. And Satori connects to the warrior state of being. Even in the gym, Dan needs to meditate on his actions and not focus on the outcomes. He does not worry about what is going to happen, but he concentrates on what he is doing, and with full concentration he does his gymnasm. And eventually Dan dates Linda and achieves his dream of becoming a champion. But somehow he remains dissatisfied and incomplete. And for this, Socrates says that the goal of Dan's journey is unreasonable happiness, the state of being present and enjoying simple things in life. Dan improves his meditation practice and feels awake as his graduation approaches. Joy again comes into his life, and Dan manages to beat her in a race. Now Joy tells Dan that according to Socrates, their paths are different. That is, their paths diverge, and therefore he must forget her. And this really makes Dan very unhappy, but Socrates touches his head and Dan loses his memory of Joy. Dan goes on a run with Socrates, but on the way, Socrates collapses. Dan prays for Socrates' life, and eventually Socrates awakens. And at the hospital, Socrates tells him that he has an issue in his heart. And he says that Dan does not have a fully open heart yet. And a warrior's life is all about love. And Socrates says that he is going to release Dan so that Dan can go and search for what is the purpose of his life. And he advises him to continue his life search. Now both Socrates and Dan, that is the teacher and student, part ways. That is, they go in different ways. Now Dan marries Linda and they have a daughter, and he finds a job as a gymnastic coach, and daily life overtakes him. But slowly their marriage fails and he and Linda get separated. Now Dan is still pursuing happiness, and he decides to take a journey around the world in search of enlightenment. And finally realizes that his biggest fear is death. Now back home, Dan meets a young woman named Joyce, and immediately somehow he gets connected with her, but their relationship does not proceed further because his family is more important to him. And he's living in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and at this time Socrates suddenly appears and tells him that he's going to give his final lessons to him. Now Dan is free of illusions and is still searching for a sense of self. And Socrates says that he is close to his goal, that is the gate. And he explains that happiness is a state of being and its secret is life itself. With another transformative vision, he helps Dan realize that death is an illusion. And in the vision, Dan senses that everything in the world is one and nothing matters. What really matters, very important to a person, is his life. Now Socrates warns Dan that he is going to leave him, and one day, as he said, he disappears mysteriously. Now the teacher and the student have separated, but Dan somehow feels that Socrates is always there because he can feel his presence. Now Dan returns to an ordinary life. He decides to call Joyce and invites her to live with him. And he tells about his life with Socrates, and She says that somehow Dan and Socrates appear familiar to her, and she also says that her nickname is Joy. And she and Dan eventually marry, and on the wedding night, Dan says final goodbye to Socrates. And now he knows that his mentor is now one with everything, and that he'll always remain with him, and the story ends here. If you have anything more to add on to what I've said, please write it in the comment box. Like the video, share it with your friends, and if you have not subscribed my channel, please subscribe and support. Thank you.